If you dig beneath the hearthstone of an old English cottage, your trowel may strike something that is not stone. A scrape. You find the shoulder of a buried jug sealed tight. If you lift it, you hear a faint, dry rattle, the clinking of pins, the whisper of iron. You have found a witch bottle. But this is not an artifact of malice. It is an artifact of fear. A trap, a shield, a prayer turned to iron, buried in the heart of the home to protect its family from something they truly believed was trying to get in. The question is, what? Welcome to the Candlelight Historian. Across Britain and Ireland, beneath the old timber and thatch, people once turned to the cunning folk, wise women and conjurers who healed the sick, lifted curses and trapped evil in glass. In their hands, medicine and magic were never separate things, and in the walls of their homes, they left behind the strangest prayers of all, sealed against the dark. Tonight we open one of those bottles and step into the world of the cunning folk and the witch bottles they left behind. The wise ones of the villages. They were called wise women, charmers, pellers. In the silence of the parish lanes from the 15th to the 19th centuries, they were the indispensable service providers. In the liminal world of pre-modern Britain and Ireland, the veil between the natural and the supernatural was perilously thin. Sickness, a spoiled crop, a lost locket, a cow gone dry. These were rarely seen as accidents. They were acts. They were the result of an unseen agency, a malignant gaze, a whispered curse. And when misfortune struck, when the world no longer made sense, you did not go to the magistrate. You did not, perhaps, even go to the priest, whose prayers felt too distant for such an immediate earthly problem. You went to the local cunning person. They were not the malevolent witches of diabolical pacts, feared by the church. Nor were they the learned, elite necromancers of high society, poring over forbidden texts. They were the local healers, the diviners, the fixers, offering practical solutions to the everyday anxieties of their neighbours. The name itself, Cunning, speaks volumes. It comes not from our modern sense of slyness or deceit, but from the Old English cunning, to know, or to have power. They were the wise folk, the possessors of a specialized practical craft that offered solutions when conventional means had failed. Their names were woven into the local dialect, familiar and specific. In southern England, the Midlands and Wales, they were the cunning man and cunning woman. In Cornwall, they were pellers, a name some suggest comes from expellers, for their work in driving out malevolent spirits. The Welsh term dain hispes translates literally to the knowing man or woman, again, a name rooted in knowledge. Across the sea in Ireland, the nomenclature was just as descriptive, the bean fisa, woman of knowledge, or the ban faid, seeress. This was a pan-European phenomenon, a social role, not an aberration. In France, they were the Devons guérisseurs, soothsayer healers, or, more pointedly, the leveur de sorts, curse lifters. In Germany, a hexenmeister, witchmaster, or Kräuterhexe, herb witch. The Italian benandanti, or good walkers, were famed for their nocturnal battles against evil forces. In Poland, they had szeptucha. These were not names for outcasts. They were job titles. In the popular imagination, the common people drew a sharp, clear line. The witch was evil, a source of harm who cursed and destroyed. The cunning person was useful, a restorer of balance. They were the primary defense against witchcraft, offering a comprehensive package of anti-witch measures. And yet they walked a blade's edge. To the church, to the theologian, there was no good magic. All power not from God was, by default, from the devil. The cunning man was at once the village healer, and in the eyes of the bishop, a heretic in waiting. He was the paradox of the parish, simultaneously revered as a healer and suspected by the authorities as a trafficker in forbidden arts. They lived and worked in the ambiguity of the fog, in that liminal space between the sacred and the profane. The alchemy of the everyday. So what was this cunning craft? What exactly did you purchase when you crossed their threshold? It was not, as some later romantics imagined, a hidden pagan survival. It was a dynamic, living bricolage, a syncretic blend of practices, an alchemy of the everyday. Forget the satanic rituals of panicked pamphlets. The historical cunning folk were almost universally Christian. Their power, in the eyes of their clients, often came from their ability to harness divine force for practical ends. Their magic was deeply, inextricably embedded in a Christian worldview. A healing charm for a fever might blend an herbal poultice, a remedy passed down through generations, with the recitation of a psalm, or a prayer to Jesus, Mary, or the saints whispered over the wound. They used holy water, or even, in some cases, the consecrated Eucharist, using the sanctioned power of the Church for their own magical purposes. This tradition was ancient. The Anglo-Saxon leech book, the Lacnunga, prescribes a set of Christian prayers to be recited over medicine ingredients, which were then to be mixed using straws inscribed with the names of the 4 evangelists. The cunning folk were simply continuing this centuries-old fusion of faith and folk remedy. But they had another tool. They were knowledge brokers, standing between the oral traditions of the village and the power of the written word. They were not peasants. They were often artisans, farmers, tradesmen, the semi-literate class. They could read, and in a world where many could not, that was a form of power. They consulted almanacs for rudimentary astrology, timing their rituals to planetary hours, not as devil worship, but as working with the natural rhythms God had created. And they possessed, or claimed to possess, grimoires, books of spells. These were their manuals, their marks of authority. Through them, the complex text-based rituals of high magic, symbols from the Key of Solomon, Hebrew names for God like Adonai and Elohim, were filtered down from the world of the elite necromancer, adapted and repurposed for the concrete, everyday problems of the common folk. And what problems they were. The cunning folk were, in essence, the walk-in clinic for rural Europe. Their services were vast, a catalogue of human anxiety. Healing was most common. They were consulted when a doctor had failed, or when an illness was suspected of having supernatural origins, a bewitchment or an affliction from the fairies. In 1604, for example, the Northumberland cunning women Catherine Thompson and Anne Nevilson were convicted for a healing ritual that involved placing a duck's beak to a woman's mouth while reciting charms. Their practice covered both humans and animals, a critical service in an agrarian world where the health of livestock was paramount. A cornerstone of their craft was counter-witchcraft, or unbewitching. They were the community's primary defense, which is precisely why they were so valued. They were also the community's detectives. They were frequently hired to locate lost or stolen property and to identify the thieves. This was risky. In 1382, a man named Robert Berenwold was prosecuted after he accused a woman of theft. But their reputation alone was often enough. The mere threat of consulting a cunning person could prompt a thief to secretly return what they had stolen just to avoid magical retribution. And, of course, they were counselors in matters of the heart. They provided charms to attract a lover or ensure a spouse's fidelity. In 1673, the cunning man Peter Banks of Newcastle was charged for offering to draw up a magical contract to bind a husband to his wife for a year. These services were likely popular with a female clientele who had little other legal or social recourse. This knowledge could also turn to darker, though equally practical, ends. such as providing herbal concoctions to induce an abortion. Their craft was a creative, pragmatic synthesis. They were the oracular authorities, providing meaning and solutions for a life governed by uncertainty. The witch bottle, a spell of fear and glass. Of all their services, none is more visceral, more potent than the act of unbewitching. And for that, they had the witch bottle. Imagine the scene: a cottage, dark save for the guttering fire. A child is sick, a sickness that does not break, or the cattle are dying, one by one. The doctor has failed, his remedies useless. This is not natural, this is maleficium, a curse, an act of malice. The cunning man is called. He asks for three things: something of the victim, something sharp, and a vessel. The ritual is pure, primal, sympathetic magic operating on two key principles. First, the law of contagion. This principle holds that things once in contact continue to act on each other at a distance. The victim's urine is collected in the bottle. This is the bait. The logic is that the witch's spell, the invisible dart, having contaminated the victim, is now present in their urine. Fingernail clippings and human hair are often added, strengthening this magical link, this tag lock. The bottle has now become a proxy for the victim's body. Second, the law of similarity. This states that like produces like. An effect can be produced by imitating it. The bottle itself becomes an effigy or poppet of the witch. A German Bellarmine jug was perfect for this. Its pot-bellied humanoid shape and grotesque bearded face a ready-made stand-in for the malevolent presence. The body of the bottle was seen as the witch's body. Specifically, it was thought to represent their bladder. Then, the attack. Once the bait has drawn the spell, the witch's spirit, into the vessel, the aggressive components are activated. The aggressors are added: bent iron pins, rusty nails, thorns, shards of broken glass. Each pin is deliberately, meticulously bent, a symbolic act, perhaps a form of ritual killing, rendering it inert in the physical world to activate its power in the spirit realm where the witch operated. Their function was twofold. Metaphorically, they would impale and trap the spirit. Sympathetically, they were meant to inflict agonizing, mirrored pain upon the witch. The sharp points in the bottle, combined with the victim's urine, would create an excruciating, tormenting urinary affliction, a magical cystitis, making it impossible for them to urinate. Finally, binding elements, black or red thread, to entangle and hold the negative energy, and iron, always iron, a metal widely held in European folklore to be abhorrent to witches, fairies, and other evil spirits, adding a final layer of apotropaic power. The bottle is sealed, a spell of fear and glass. It is now a supernatural trap, a weapon of retaliation. The witch, it was believed, would be forced to revoke the spell to end their own suffering or die from the agony. Faith, witchcraft, and the law. To create such an object, to practice this retaliatory sorcery, was to tread on dangerous ground. The cunning folk operated in the razor-thin space between communal acceptance and official condemnation. To the average villager, the cunning person was a hero, the only one who could fight back against the unseen. As historian Owen Davies noted, to the common person, witches were evil, but cunning folk were useful. This popular consensus was their shield. In Essex, a county notorious for its brutal witch trials, of 400 people tried for witchcraft, only 4 were identified as cunning folk. The community, by and large, protected their healers. But the authorities, the church, the crown, they saw no difference. Theologians, both Protestant and Catholic, argued that any magic, good or ill, was a usurpation of God's power. To them, the cunning man's healing charm and the witch's killing curse Both drank from the same diabolical well. Clergy actively tried to smear them, branding them as witches to collapse the popular distinction, arguing that the lure of magic tempted people away from faith in divine providence. The law itself was a shifting tide, a barometer of elite attitudes towards the supernatural. In the early modern period, legislation could be severe. The Witchcraft Act of 1541, for example, could punish the casting of a simple love spell with death, though it was quickly repealed. The subsequent Act of 1563 was less harsh, and crucially, the courts began to focus primarily on maleficium, tangible, physical harm, or explicitly harmful witchcraft. This legal grey area is what allowed most cunning folk to practice with relatively little interference. The real change, the death blow to the cunning craft, came not from faith, but from reason. The Enlightenment. The Witchcraft Act of 1735 was a profound ideological turning point. It didn't just repeal the old laws, it denied the very existence of magic and witches. The crime was no longer heresy or demonic conspiracy. The crime was fraud. Anyone who claimed to have magical powers was now deemed a swindler, a common criminal, and could be imprisoned for a year. The cunning person was reclassified from sorcerer to con artist. This intellectual assault was codified by legal pressure in the 19th century. The Vagrancy Act of 1824 specifically outlawed fortune-telling. And then, the Medical Act of 1858 created a formal register of licensed medical practitioners. This new, powerful professional class had the legal backing to prosecute the traditional village healer, the cunning person, as an unlicensed, dangerous quack. The journey from healer to heretic to fraudster was complete. It was not because the craft had changed, but because the society around it had fundamentally redefined knowledge, power, and legitimacy. Bottles in the walls. And so, the cunning craft faded, driven underground, quite literally. For centuries, the witch bottle was a story, a piece of folklore, a curiosity mentioned in texts. Then, we began to dig. Modern archaeology has unearthed hundreds of these artifacts, and they reveal a story even more complex, more nuanced than the old texts. The vessel of choice in the 16th and 17th centuries was that German salt-glazed stoneware, the Bartmann jug, or bellamine. Imported in vast quantities to hold liquids, they were perfect. They were robust, ideal for surviving burial or, perhaps, heating on a fire. And most importantly, their distinctive anthropomorphic features, the rotund belly and the molded, grotesque bearded face, made them a perfect ready-made effigy for trapping a spirit. But it is their placement that is so significant. The written accounts, like those of Joseph Blagrave in the 17th century, describe an aggressive, curative ritual, placing the sealed bottle in a roaring fire until it explodes. A magical grenade intended to cause immediate, unbearable torment, to kill or maim the witch and break the spell. This was an active counterattack against an existing affliction. But the archaeological record shows something different. The overwhelming majority of bottles are found intact. They are found deliberately, carefully concealed in the liminal spaces of the home, the architectural weak points, the portals, considered most vulnerable to supernatural intrusion. They are buried upside down beneath the hearth or plastered into the brickwork of the chimney. They are hidden under the threshold of the main door or in the walls surrounding a window. We can now open them, not with magic, but with science. The famous Greenwich bottle, an intact 17th century bellarmine, was excavated and subjected to extensive analysis. It confirmed the stories with chilling precision. It contained urine from a smoker, brimstone, sulfur, 12 iron nails, 8 brass pins, human hair, 10 manicured fingernail clippings, and a small piece of leather cut into the shape of a heart and pierced by a pin. The Holywell bottle, found in London and dating to the late 17th century, was a stoneware vessel found under a doorway. It contained approximately 60 bent copper pins and rusty nails. The Reigate bottle, a green glass wine bottle from around 1720, held 9 meticulously bent brass pins and human hair. This practice even crossed the Atlantic. A nail-filled bottle from the Civil War era was found in Virginia, a folk tradition carried in the cultural baggage of colonial immigrants. This evidence points to a different, or perhaps parallel function, not just a one-time curative attack, but a permanent, passive, prophylactic defense, a spiritual security system, a silent guardian, buried in the foundations, forever trapping any evil that might try to enter. This discrepancy, the text versus the earth, has sparked a scholarly debate. Some argue the buried bottles are simply failed rituals, where the boiling was never completed. But the sheer number and consistent, careful placement suggest that long-term protection was, at the very least, a widespread intention. It is most likely that we are not looking at one single uniform ritual, but a spectrum of related practices. The boiling method may have been the most extreme retaliatory act reserved for dire circumstances. But the buried bottle, that was a more common, generalized form of magical home defense. The archaeology of emotion, unearthing a hidden, constant fear. Why we believed. But why? Why this elaborate, hidden world of counter-magic? To understand the witch bottle, you must understand the terror that filled it. You must inhabit the anxious landscape of the pre-modern world. In a world before germ theory, before modern psychiatry or comprehensive insurance, the belief in witchcraft and malevolent spirits provided a crucial explanatory framework for the random, brutal nature of misfortune. Misfortune was not random, it was sent. A sudden illness, a stillborn calf, a paralyzing seizure. That was not chance. That was agency. One of the most pervasive threats was the evil eye. This was the belief that a person, often one with an envious glance or specific features like red hair or dark, lowering eyebrows, could cause harm to people and livestock simply by looking at them. To be overlooked was to be cursed. The fear was so ingrained that social protocols evolved to mitigate it. Upon admiring a child, one would immediately say, "God bless it," to neutralize any unintentional harm. Equally feared, particularly in Ireland, were the fairies, or the seedy, a sudden debilitating illness, what we might call a stroke or a seizure, was known as the pox seedy, the fairy stroke. It was believed to be a physical attack, a fairy blast of wind or a strike from an invisible fairy dart. The prehistoric flint arrowheads found in ploughed fields were seen as tangible proof of these supernatural weapons. For this, you needed a specialist, the fairy doctor, a type of cunning person with particular knowledge of the good folk. This worldview, while terrifying, was psychologically preferable to a universe governed by pure, meaningless chaos. If a curse had a sender, it could be fought. If an illness had a cause, it could have a remedy. Apotropaic magic, protective magic, was a vital psychological tool for managing this profound ambient anxiety. The act of creating a witch bottle was an act of profound psychological power. It restored a sense of agency. It transformed the passive, suffering victim into an active, righteous combatant. It gave form to the formless, a tangible focus for fear and a clear pathway to resolution. It also served a social function. It allowed for the externalization of complex communal tensions, personal rivalries, and even feelings of guilt. These could be projected onto an external figure, the witch, who became the locus of all misfortune, making the counter-magic a justified retaliatory act to restore balance. These bottles, the concealed shoes found in walls, the dried cats found in chimneys, they are what archaeologists call a material culture of anxiety. They are the physical fossils of past fears, a tangible map of vulnerability. Their placement in the home's liminal spaces, the hearth, the threshold, the windows, effectively maps a cognitive geography of vulnerability. These were the weak points in the domestic fortress, the portals through which the chaotic, dangerous supernatural outside could intrude upon the safe, ordered inside. Echoes in modern shadows. The cunning folk themselves are gone, the laws of the 19th century, the rise of scientific rationalism, the professionalization of medicine, all conspired to erode their trade. The intellectual shift of the Enlightenment, which had already reframed magic as fraud among the elite, began to permeate all of society through public education. A more centralized police force began to enforce the vagrancy acts more vigorously, making the craft an untenable, risky business. The village healer, the charmer, the unbewitcher faded into the realm of folklore, but their archetype, their shadow, did not disappear. It was resurrected and remythologized to serve new spiritual and cultural needs. In the 20th century, new spiritual movements looked to the past for roots. The religion of Wicca, developed by Gerald Gardner in the 1950s, was heavily influenced by the witch cult hypothesis of anthropologist Margaret Murray. Murray's theory, now widely discredited by historians, posited that the victims of the witch trials were actually adherents of a surviving pre-Christian pagan religion. Some modern pagans and Wiccans see a spiritual connection to the older traditions of the cunning folk, but historians like Owen Davies and Ronald Hutton have convincingly argued that there is no direct, unbroken lineage. The historical craft of the cunning folk, after all, was fundamentally, syncretically Christian. This is a fact ideologically alien to the pagan-centric theology of most modern witchcraft. In response to Wicca, other traditional witchcraft revivalists have emerged, explicitly seeking to reconstruct the historical cunning craft. But this, too, often involves a selective reinterpretation, frequently de-emphasizing or entirely removing the historical Christian context to create a more earth-centered spirituality that aligns with contemporary needs. And then there is the darkness. The figure of the cunning person, their ambiguous morality, and their potent, earthy magic has become a central trope in the modern genre of folk horror. This genre explores the unsettling persistence of ancient beliefs in a rational world, the conflict between isolated rural tradition and modern urbanity, the terrifying power of landscape and belief. The witch bottle itself appears as an ominous plot device in novels like Andrew Michael Hurley's The Loney. The cunning person is the titular, terrifying figure in Adam Neville's Cunning Folk. Films like The Witch, 2015, and A Field in England, 2013, immerse us in that pre-modern worldview where the magic of cunning folk and witches is terrifyingly real. The historical cunning person has become a floating signifier. They are detached from their complex, specific historical context. They become a wise, spiritual ancestor for the neo-pagan and a terrifying primal archetype for the folk horror genre. In both of these modern visions, the nuanced historical reality, that of a pragmatic, often semi-literate, Christian-inflected tradesperson navigating a complex social and legal world, is largely sublimated. Their modern afterlife reveals more about our own 21st century anxieties and our own spiritual desires than it does about the pre-modern world in which they actually lived. Today, the witch bottles sit in museums. They are catalogued, analyzed, and displayed behind glass. We look at them with a sense of detached, rational curiosity. We see superstition, we see a pre-scientific mind, we see folklore. But what we are really looking at is a mirror. The contents of the bottle, the pins, the nails, the hair, were not magic. The magic, the power, was the need for the bottle. It was the visceral human desire for agency, for control, for protection in the face of overwhelming, inexplicable misfortune. We have our own anxieties, our own irrational fears of the dark, of the future, of the unseen forces that seem to govern our lives. The cunning folk are gone. The world they served is gone. But the fear that sealed the bottle, that endures. And it reminds us of a time when the veil between worlds was thin, and when the only way to fight the darkness was to capture it, seal it in glass, and bury it, with hope, under the warmth of the hearth. Thank you for joining the Candlelight Historian. If this story spoke to you, leave a light in the dark, a like, a comment, a thought for the old fears that once kept our ancestors awake. Until next time, keep the candle burning, and beware what is sealed beneath your own hearth.